Hey guys, this is Garrett, McLaughlin. On this week's edition of Mobility Monday, what I want to take a look at is the hip once again. Again, last week we're taking a look at the hip as far as the adductors, again, muscles of the groin and the inner thigh. This week I want to look at the hip flexors, psoas, iliacus, and the posterior hip capsule. So a lot of times just from regular seated positions, and a lot of people sitting throughout the day, driving, flying, sitting at a desk, we tend to really tighten up and limit range of motion through this hip flexor. So that becomes a big problem in low back cases, hip pain. It causes a lot of issues throughout the kinetic chain. So one thing we need to realize is the psoas actually comes off the lumbar spine, get deep into the back, comes forward and attaches to the femur here to pull the knee up towards the chest. And if you notice, if you're in that seated position for too long, the psoas and the iliacus are really going to shorten, and that's going to limit hip extension. So that's a fundamental movement as far as running, most of athletics. I mean, just through that walking cycle, if we're not able to fully extend the hip because we're limited through this anterior here, we have a lot of problems as far as having normal range of motion in movement. So what we want to do first is take a look, are we tight and restricted through those hip flexors? So a good simple test to look at is what's called the Thomas test. So what we're going to do here is laying on the table here, you want to go as close as you can to the edge so your butt is almost hanging off forward off the table. You're not sitting completely on. So top of the butt on the table, come back, hold one leg, knee to chest. Seeing where that thigh rest is what we're looking for. So from here, if I'm relaxed back and I'm just letting that left leg relax down, if this knee doesn't get to parallel with the hip or lower, we know we have some kind of restriction through the hip flexors. So a couple things we can look at there. That knee position, again, does the knee fall past the hip joint? Is it lower? Is it stuck up here? I mean, a lot of people, you'll notice as they come back, they're holding that knee up into that flex, the thigh into that flex position. That's how we know we have restriction. We can also, if we have any kind of tightness to the rectus femoris, again, also a hip flexion, but one of the quad muscles, as you lay back here and pull that knee to chest, you'll notice the leg will straighten out. So that's how you know you have more of a quad or rectus femoris contracture as opposed to the hip flexor. So those are two ways, or one simple way to look at a couple different things as far as hip flexor and quad tightness. So if you laid on your back and that knee was resting above hip level, what you want to do is go ahead and open up and really try to release those hip flexors. First thing we're going to do from a self-myofascial release standpoint, grab a lacrosse ball. Again, releasing the psoas and iliacus is challenging just because that psoas is pretty deep down there from the spine to the femur. So we really need to kind of lay deep in the belly, get next to the belly button, deep in here, try to get in through there. So what we're going to do is lay on our stomach, get that lacrosse ball. You try to find the belly button first, go right up to the side there. You're going to lay face down into that ball, try to roll around till you find a nice, tender, uncomfortable area. And then once you can hold on to that spot, nice deep breaths. So what we're trying to do is scan down towards the hip. And once you get down more towards the front of the hip, you'll really be able to get into that hip flexor a lot better. And if we can, roll from, you think of the hip kind of like a bowl sitting here. If you feel the bone or the ASIS here, if we can roll and scan that area from the front of the hip over to there and try to get the entire thing, the psoas and the iliacus, I mean, that is really a good place to start. After we do that, going through just normal hip flexor stretching is the best. Again, this is typically a stretch a lot of people are doing wrong. So a couple basics for getting that stretch right. Again, nice comfortable position, ankles under the knee, knees under the hip, back is up nice and tall. We don't need to excessively lean forward. So what we want to do is kind of tuck our hips underneath us, dig the back toe into the ground to engage the glute here, and then from that position, I haven't really even lunged forward yet, I'm already feeling a stretch to that hip flexor, but you can from there add a nice easy lean forward and holding that position. Hips are tucked under, glute is engaged, I'm holding. I can lift, so my right leg is down, I can lift my right arm up, I can rotate to the left side and try to extend. That helps lengthen through the psoas and the iliacus. So what we also run into, again, we looked at that from more of a flexibility and muscular point of view. What we also run into from the seated position is we become tight and restricted through the posterior joint capsule. So if you think of that seated position, if this is the thigh, this is the hip, oftentimes because we're seated in this position, that femur, the head of the femur will ride more anteriorly, which tightens up that posterior joint capsule. Anterior joint capsule becomes lax. So from a mobility standpoint, what we can do from there is add in some simple anterior to posterior mobility at the hip. If we go, so same leg I was working on here, all the way up through the inner thigh, again trying to get that band as high as you can around the head of the femur. What we're going to do is keep that as our bottom leg. Go into that same hip flexor stretch, back up nice and tall, everything's the same, nothing changed even though we're adding a band on here. And tuck the hips under, back up tall, small lunge forward, and you can even open up and rotate if you want to. So you think of in this position, if we have the head of the femur that's riding forward, what we can do right here, we're trying to pull that femur back into the joint to help loosen up that posterior joint capsule where it tends to get tight and restricted, that causes that joint to set out of place, to help better centrate the joint. And this allows for better motion, more fluid motion of the hip joint. So again, same hip flexor stretch, kind of tuck under, nice easy lunge forward. We have our anterior to posterior mobilization through the hip, and that's how we mobilize. So again, going through those steps, first thing is to look at, to actually see if you are restricted through the hip flexors. Again, try that Thomas test, see where the knee position is, and you might need a friend to take a look from the side to see if the knee is hanging up above the hip, or if you are able to drop lower and you don't have a restriction through there. Other than that, go in self-myofascial release. Again, lacrosse ball is tough to get into the psoas and hip flexors. It's not an easy area to get into the correct way, but any kind of soft tissue work, ART is really good to get in there, release those muscles if you need an additional hand, and stretch. Try to lengthen through the anterior, go through the hip flexor stretch, and then what we're going to do is posterior joint capsule with the band to help mobilize the joint, get the head of that femur back sitting in its correct position, and then from there movement should be a lot more fluid. So thank you guys, thanks for checking out Mobility Monday, and I'll see you next week.